Hey everyone, and welcome to this video. I'm Glenn, and this is episode 13 of the Oathsworn painting series. In this episode, I'm painting the Venerator. If you're new to miniature painting, I hope you find this video interesting and helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comment section below. As usual, let's see how I went from a pristine unpainted miniature to this fully painted one. Let's begin. First, I removed all the mold lines by using a hobby knife. To remove any scratches caused by the knife, I used thin plastic cement to create a smooth and even surface. The glue is dry and I cleaned the model in soapy water, rinsed it in clean water and let it dry. Then I primed the model with Chaos Black primer. Next, I used an airbrush to make a zenithal light effect by applying a white color from above. This can also be applied by using a can of white primer. Now we're all set and good to go. I prepared the speed paint I have in mind on the palette, starting with Moonlake Coral on the cape. I use a cheap synthetic brush when applying speed paints as base coats. What I like about the speed paints as base coats is their ability to define the model effectively. They flow into the crevices, creating a darker tone to separate the different parts of the model. The next color is cellared yellow, which I apply to the other cape. To make the cape a bit more accessible, I tried to pull the legs and they came right off. I use Hive Dweller purple on the legs. And follow up with the same color on the lower armor section, such as the chainmail, stomach, and the arms. For the upper armor section, I use the same purple color, but this time I incorporate Prismatic Bolt to create another tone of color. As the speed paints blends very well together, I can mix them either on the model or on the palette. Here things got a bit strange. The paint doesn't seem to adhere properly on the helmet, chest and the shoulder pauldrons. It's almost as if the paint is sliding off, leaving a lighter finish. Instead of trying to fix it right away, I'm going to leave it as it is and come back to it once the paint has dried. I move on to the altar and use hardened leather, avoiding the candles. I then proceed with palette bone on the candles, blending in Prismatic bolts to create a diverse range of candles. If I find that there's too much paint on the brush, I simply wipe it off on a cloth. I apply hardened leather on the top and on the edges of the book. And for the book cover, I use Moonlake Coral. The upper armor section is dry, so I return to apply more speed paint using the same colors as before. I aim to incorporate a tone of Prismatic Bolt, which I'll enhance as a focal point in a later stage. This is applied across the shoulder pauldrons, the chest and onto the helmet. Next, I paint the metal parts on the hammer using a mix of the same colors. The first layer is dry and I follow up with a second layer. I paint the base as usual, slap on some speed paints using grey, brown, green and yellow speed paints. With the base coat done, the model looks something like this. I switch to a fine brush, a size 2 Winsor & Newton Series 7. I begin to layer the model starting with Everland Sunset. I ended up covering the entire yellow cape. There were a lot of wrinkles or splatter from the other paints. I switch back to a synthetic brush and apply Cellared Yellow to shade the yellow color. Back to the fine brush and Everland Sunset to illuminate the cape. I use thin brush strokes targeting the exposed areas and the edges. This technique creates a textured effect. The key is a brush with a pointed tip. By using a size 2 brush, it retains moisture for a longer duration compared to a smaller brush. After that layer, I use a mix of Everland Sunset and Ethereal Yellow and repeat the process. Next, I use pure Ethereal Yellow and repeat the process again, but with a focus on the edges and exposed areas. For the last layer and highlights, I use Dawn Yellow. I move on to the other cape using a mix of 2 parts Gravelord Grey and 1 part Moonlake Coral. I apply this to the entire cape to add more saturation and ensure the paint doesn't pull up too much on the lower part. The speed paint is dry and I apply a second coat to darken the cape even more. Next, I layer the cape, envisioning where the light source would hit the model, and layer these areas using Screamer Pink. In this instance, I envision the light source from above, so I keep the upper part of the cape dark to simulate the shadow cast by the altar. The process is similar to the yellow cape, gradually using brighter tones of colors. Next I apply a mix of Screamer Pink and Warlord Purple. Then I layer pure Warlord Purple on the most exposed and raised areas. After that, I add small scratches to the cape using a mix of Screamer Pink and Morecast Bone. Finally, I follow up with a mix of 3 parts Speed Paint Medium, 2 parts Gravelord Grey and 1 part Moonlake Coral to tie everything together on the cape. I move on to the altar and apply a mix of 2 parts Gravelord Grey and 1 part Hardened Leather. This is to shade the altar. The speed paint is dry and I paint all the metal bits on the altar using Dark Reaper. Additionally, I paint the inside of the frames. Next, I use a mix of Dark Reaper and Fenrisian Grey to brighten up the metal parts, focusing on the exposed areas. I also apply Ghost Green for variation on the edges. The final highlight consists of Fenrisian Grey mixed with Oathsworn Grey, or just pure Oathsworn Grey, applied to the very edges. I thin down Dumble Brown with water and add this as dirt or rust to the metal parts. I painted the 2 small pillars on the sides using the same process. For the wood parts I use Rhinox hide for the areas I found a bit too light. And highlight with Morecast Bone. I layer and highlight the candles with Morecast Bone and Ghost Green. For further highlights, I mix the colors with Oathsworn Grey. Then I apply pure white on the flames. Next I apply cellared yellow. It's a mix of 4 parts speed paint medium and 1 part color. This is applied on the flames and the top of the candles. I also apply this mix to the front of the upper row of candles to mimic the warm light coming from the lower row of candles. I follow up with Fire Giant Orange, applying this to the flames while keeping some of the yellow color. Let's move on to the gold trim. As I would like to use the non-metallic metal method, I apply Rhinox hide onto all the gold trim. Next I follow up with Mournfang Brown, applying it pretty much to all the gold areas, except for the areas I would like to appear the darkest. The next color is XV88. Now I begin to decide where I would like the most intense focal points, which help create the illusion of reflection. Later in the process I just skip this color and move straight to the next one, Samsey Desert. Samsey Desert is used to narrow down the focal points even more. I also mix Samsey Desert and Dawn Yellow to narrow down the focal points and apply small scratches. I narrow the focal points even more with Dawn Yellow, applying scratches and go along the edges. I painted the sides of the frames using a similar process. This also applies to the figures or symbols inside the frames. Later in the painting process of this model, I decided to enhance and refine the gold. To do this, I use a very thin glaze of aerial yellow and apply this to the gold. If I happen to apply too much, I wipe the brush off on a cloth to soak up the excess. This added a yellow tint to these areas and tied the other colors together. Once the glaze dried, I use pure white to amp up the focal points as the final highlight. I use a similar process on the other gold trim, using the same colors. As I imagine the light source coming from above, I place the focal points accordingly, like on the small frames, one point on top and one in the opposite corner. I pick out a few points along the trim and highlight the edge. It is important to have contrast between the dark brown and the focal points, to create the appearance of shining gold. This is my first attempt at non-metallic metal gold. Whenever I was in doubt on how to place the focal point, I just applied the rule of cool. I spent a lot of hours on this model, and I could easily use even more hours refining the gold, going back and forth between the different tones of colors. But at some point I just called it done and moved on. Let's move on to the armor. I use a mix of Dark Reaper and Venerator Grey. I decided to place the focal point across the pauldron as it resembles a cylinder, and paint thin lines using downwards brushstrokes. Next I apply a new layer of pure Venerator Grey, narrowing down the focal point. For the next layer I use Ghost Green. In the following layers I utilize both Oathsworn Grey and pure white for the final highlight. I introduce some random longer lines for added texture and visual interest. To ensure a smooth transition between the tones, I use a glaze of Dark Reaper, blending it between the light and dark shades. If necessary, I mix Dark Reaper with black for a darker glaze. This technique is applied across all the metal parts, somewhat similar to what I did with Uriel Yellow on the gold parts. Given the helmet's spherical shape, I paint multiple dots as focal points with pure white, connecting them across the helmet using shades of Fenrisian Grey and Oathsworn Grey. Beneath the breastplate, I broaden the focal point as I move downward. I also highlighted the scratches on the armor parts using white. For the chainmail, I apply Mournfang Brown as dirt and apply highlights afterwards. I painted the focal points along the hammer's handle. I clean up the belt and straps using a mix of Rhinox hide and Hive Dweller purple. I follow up with XV88 to paint some scratches and highlight the edges. Morkar's bone served as the final highlight. I use a glaze of Rhinox hide and Hive Dweller purple. And to complete the look, I cleaned up the buckles. Now onto the Hammerhead. I aim to mimic the appearance of marble. Starting with Dark Reaper, I apply it with a sponge to achieve a sporadic pattern. For the areas where the sponge couldn't reach, I use a brush to stipple on the paint. I use Dark Reaper with a brush to connect some of the spots, creating the marble veins. Then I use pure white and apply it to some areas where Dark Reaper was previously applied. Since white isn't completely opaque, some of the Dark Reaper will still be visible, which adds to the natural look of marble. The key is to create random marble veins. To blend the veins into the hammerhead, I prepare a few speed paints by mixing 2 parts medium with 1 part color. I use Holy White on the exposed areas and Battleship Grey on the less exposed areas. I continue with pure white. I apply it to some of the already white areas to achieve a clean white appearance. With the marble effect complete, let's prepare the book for some freehand work. I start by layering XV88, Morkar's bone and white gradually onto the pages. I apply the layers thinly, especially with the lighter colors. With each new layer, I also paint thin, uneven lines to represent the pages. After completing the pages, I make a quick sketch as a reference. Using a pencil, I divide the pages into sections, using them as guidelines. I then paint the symbol according to the guidelines and reference, using a mix of black and Rhinox hide. I use a smaller brush, a size 1 Winsor & Newton Series 7, and keep it moist to maintain precision. When painting straight lines, I twist and turn the model to drag the brush towards myself, making it easier to achieve precision. Now I begin shaping the lines into arrows. And add a short line across each arrow. Next, I paint a square using corn red. Inside the square, I add a capital letter. I also add some text, painting almost straight lines. Afterward, I paint small lines or dots in the opposite direction to add variation to the text. Continuing with the rest of the book, I paint more symbols and text. At the bottom, I create the illusion of a torn page, starting with a jagged line to represent the shadow. Above the jagged line, I add an aligned highlight. Lastly, I paint the capital letters on the next page. For the book cover, I use a mix of Screamer Pink and Black. I then apply a darker mix of Screamer Pink and Black as a shade. And highlight with Warlord Purple. I paint some scratches on the cover to add texture, and painted the decoration on the corners as gold. I decided to add a reflection of the candles on the back of the helmet, using a mix of 2 parts medium and 1 part color. Moving on to the base, I highlight it and add details as in previous videos, using tones of grey, green, brown and yellow. I go the 2 laps around the base rim with a black color. Then I applied a few coats of Satin Varnish using an airbrush to give the armor a subtle sheen. I apply matte varnish on the fabrics, the book and the wood and candles to give these areas a matte finish. Lastly, I attach a few tufts and leaves to the base using super glue and went over the hammerhead again with satin varnish to give it a polished look. With that, let's have a look at the final result.
Accursed creatures stand at our gates. Never mind. Like and subscribe, you bastards. You are all mine.